The morning sun cast long shadows across the barren hills as Marcus wiped the sweat from his weathered face. His small flock of goats moved slowly through the sparse grass, their bells creating a gentle melody that had become the soundtrack of his increasingly difficult life. At 42 years old, Marcus had been herding livestock for over 2 decades, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. But times were different now, and the traditional ways of making a living from the land were becoming harder each passing year. The drought had lasted 18 months, turning once green pastures into cracked earth and dust. Marcus watched his animals struggle to find adequate grazing, their ribs showing more prominently with each passing week. He had already sold 12 of his best goats just to buy feed for the remaining 38, and even that meager income was running out. His wife Elena had taken a job at the local market, selling vegetables and handmade crafts to tourists, but her earnings barely covered their basic household expenses. Their small stone house sat at the edge of the village, overlooking the valley where Marcus spent most of his days. The roof needed repairs, and several tiles had fallen during the last storm 3 months ago. Elena had placed buckets strategically around their bedroom to catch the rainwater that seeped through, but even those repairs would have to wait. Every peso they earned went toward food, medicine for Elena's aging mother who lived with them, and the increasingly expensive feed for the animals. Marcus remembered better times when his herd numbered over 100 goats and sheep. Buyers would come from the city, offering good prices for healthy livestock. The local restaurants would purchase fresh milk and cheese, and during festival seasons, families would order whole animals for celebrations. Those days felt like a distant dream now. Climate change, economic uncertainty, and competition from large commercial farms had squeezed small herders like Marcus almost to the breaking point. As he guided his goats toward a small water source, Marcus noticed a group of well-dressed people walking along the dirt road that led to his village. They carried expensive cameras and wore clean hiking boots, clearly tourists exploring the rural countryside. He had seen groups like this before, usually staying for a few hours to take pictures of the authentic rural life before returning to their comfortable hotels in the city. The group approached him, speaking in accented Spanish mixed with English. The leader, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and kind eyes, asked if they could photograph him with his goats. Marcus nodded politely, as he always did. Tourism, even in small amounts, brought some income to his village, and he understood that visitors were often genuinely interested in learning about traditional ways of life. While the tourists snapped photos and asked questions about herding, Marcus noticed the woman's attention kept drifting to something at his neck. He unconsciously touched the simple silver necklace that hung there, a habit he had developed over the years. The necklace was nothing fancy, just a thin chain with a small pendant that bore the image of St. Francis, the patron saint of animals. It was one of the few possessions he never considered selling. No matter how desperate his financial situation became, the woman asked about his life, his family, and the challenges of maintaining a traditional livelihood in modern times. Marcus found himself opening up more than usual, perhaps because her genuine interest seemed different from the casual curiosity of most tourists. He told her about the drought, the declining market prices, and his fears about the future of small-scale farming in the region. Elena had packed him a simple lunch of bread, cheese and olives, which he ate while sitting on a rock overlooking his grazing goats. The tourists had moved on, but the encounter had left him thinking about the contrast between his simple life and the apparent wealth of his visitors. He did not feel bitter about this difference. Rather, it made him reflect on what truly mattered and what he valued most in his modest existence. The afternoon brought its usual routine of moving the herd to different grazing spots, always searching for patches of grass that the drought had not completely destroyed. Marcus knew every stone, every tree, every depression in the land where water might collect after rain. This knowledge had been passed down through generations, and he took pride in understanding the rhythms of the natural world, even as those rhythms seemed to be changing in ways that challenged everything his family had learned over decades. By evening, as he guided his goats back toward the village, Marcus felt the familiar weight of uncertainty about tomorrow. Feed prices were rising again, and he had received word that the local milk cooperative was reducing the prices they paid to small producers. Elena would be waiting at home with dinner, probably another creative meal made from whatever vegetables had not sold at the market that day. The small necklace at his throat caught the last rays of sunlight as he walked. His mother had given it to him on his 18th birthday, just months before she passed away from cancer. She had worn it every day of her adult life, and her mother before her had done the same. It represented not just faith, but continuity, family history, and the hope that somehow, even in the most difficult circumstances, protection and providence would find a way to sustain those who worked honestly and treated their responsibilities with respect. As the village lights began to flicker on in the distance, Marcus whistled softly to his goats, guiding them toward home. Tomorrow would bring the same challenges, the same worries about money and the future, but it would also bring the same quiet satisfaction of caring for his animals and maintaining the traditions that connected him to generations of herders who had walked these same paths. He could not have imagined that his simple life was about to change in ways that would challenge everything. He thought he knew about providence, generosity, and the unexpected ways that hope could appear when it was needed most. The encounter with the tourists, particularly the silver-haired woman who had shown such interest in his story and his modest necklace, was just the beginning of a series of events that would transform not only his circumstances, but his understanding of how interconnected human lives could be, even across vast differences in wealth and circumstance. 3 weeks had passed since the encounter with the tourists, and Marcus had nearly forgotten about the silver-haired woman and her curious interest in his necklace. Life had continued its predictable pattern of challenges and small victories. 2 of his goats had given birth to healthy kids, bringing his herd number up slightly, but feed costs continued to climb, and the drought showed no signs of ending. Elena had developed a persistent cough that worried Marcus deeply. She insisted it was nothing serious, just dust from the dry season, but he noticed how she tried to muffle the sound when she thought he was not listening. A visit to the doctor would cost money they simply did not have, especially since Elena's mother had required expensive medication the previous month for her heart condition. On this particular morning, Marcus was surprised to see a familiar figure walking up the dusty road toward his house. The silver-haired woman from the tourist group was approaching alone, carrying a small backpack and moving with the careful steps of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain. She wore simpler clothes this time, and her expression carried a purposefulness that had not been present during her casual visit weeks earlier. Marcus set down the bucket of water he had been carrying to his goats and walked toward her, curious but wary. In his experience, when outsiders returned to visit rural families, it usually meant they wanted something, often related to land purchases or development projects that rarely benefited the local people. The woman introduced herself as Catherine Morrison, explaining that she lived in Canada, but had been traveling through South America for several months. She apologized for arriving unannounced, but said she had been unable to stop thinking about their conversation and had decided to return to the village specifically to see him again. Catherine asked if they could sit and talk, and Marcus gestured toward 2 wooden chairs on the small porch of his house. Elena appeared in the doorway, offering water to their unexpected visitor, though Marcus noticed how his wife's hand went instinctively to her chest as another coughing fit threatened to emerge. As they settled into conversation, Catherine explained that she was a retired teacher who had spent most of her career working in urban schools in Toronto. She had never married and had no children, dedicating her life instead to education and modest community volunteering. Her recent travels through South America were part of what she called her late-life adventure, using savings she had accumulated over decades of careful living to explore parts of the world she had always dreamed of visiting. Marcus listened politely, still uncertain about why this woman had made the effort to return to his remote village. Catherine seemed to sense his confusion and gradually steered the conversation toward the purpose of her visit. She explained that during their first meeting, she had been struck not just by his story of struggling to maintain traditional herding practices, but by something she had observed about his character and dignity in the face of genuine hardship. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Catherine asked again about his necklace. Marcus touched it automatically, as he always did when someone mentioned it, and repeated what he had told her weeks earlier about it belonging to his mother and grandmother before her. Catherine listened intently, asking gentle questions about his family history and the significance of the St. Francis medallion. What happened next surprised Marcus completely. Catherine reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notebook filled with handwritten notes. She explained that after meeting him, she had spent considerable time researching the region, its economic challenges, and the specific difficulties facing small-scale herders. She had also, she admitted with some embarrassment, spent time thinking about her own life and what she might do with her comfortable retirement savings. Catherine then shared something that Marcus had not expected. She told him that she had been born into poverty in rural Ontario, the daughter of a farmer who had struggled with many of the same challenges that Marcus faced daily. Her family had lost their farm when she was 12 years old, forcing them to move to the city where her parents worked multiple jobs to provide for their children. Education had been Catherine's path out of poverty, but she had never forgotten the dignity and hard work of her father, who had risen before dawn every day to care for his animals and tend his land. Seeing Marcus with his goats, hearing him speak about the traditions passed down through generations, had awakened memories and emotions she had not experienced in years. Marcus found himself drawn into Catherine's story, understanding for the first time that this well-dressed, obviously comfortable woman had once lived a life not so different from his own. Her questions about his daily routine, his challenges with feed costs and market prices, had not been the casual curiosity of a tourist but the informed interest of someone who truly understood the realities of rural life. As the morning progressed, Catherine made a proposal that left Marcus speechless. She explained that she had been looking for a way to use her retirement savings meaningfully, something that would honor the memory of her own father and perhaps make a practical difference in the world. She offered to provide financial support that would allow Marcus to purchase quality feed for his herd, repair his roof, and ensure that Elena could see a doctor about her persistent cough. Marcus' immediate response was to politely decline. He explained that while he appreciated her kindness, he could not accept charity from a stranger, no matter how generous her intentions. His pride as a man who had always worked for what his family needed made it impossible for him to simply accept money, even from someone with good intentions. Catherine had anticipated this response and was prepared with a different approach. She suggested instead what she called a partnership. She proposed to invest in his herding operation, providing capital for improvements and expansion in exchange for regular updates about his progress and, eventually, a modest return on her investment if his circumstances improved. The conversation continued for hours, with Elena joining them for lunch and adding her perspective to the discussion. Catherine's proposal was more complex than simple charity. She wanted to learn about traditional herding practices, to understand how small-scale agriculture could be sustainable in challenging climates, and to document the knowledge that families like Marcus's had preserved for generations. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Catherine prepared to return to the village where she was staying. Before leaving, she made one final request that would prove to be the moment that changed everything. She asked Marcus if he would consider allowing her to photograph his necklace in detail, explaining that she wanted to research its history and craftsmanship as part of her growing interest in the cultural traditions of the region. Marcus agreed, removing the necklace for the first time in years and handing it carefully to Catherine. As she examined it closely, turning the pendant over in her hands and studying the intricate details of the St. Francis image, her expression changed in a way that Marcus could not interpret. Something about the piece seemed to have captured her attention in a manner that went beyond casual interest. Catherine took several photographs with a high-quality camera, documenting the necklace from multiple angles and making notes about its apparent age and construction. When she returned it to Marcus, her hands were trembling slightly, though she offered no explanation for her obvious excitement. As she prepared to leave, Catherine promised to return within a week with a more detailed proposal for their potential partnership. Marcus watched her walk away, uncertain about what had just transpired but sensing that his life was about to change in ways he could not yet imagine. The week that followed Catherine's visit passed with unusual tension in Marcus's household. Elena, despite her persistent cough, threw herself into cleaning and organizing their modest home with an energy that surprised her husband. She seemed to sense that something significant was approaching, though Marcus had shared only the basic details of Catherine's partnership proposal. Marcus found himself distracted during his daily routine with the goats. He would catch his mind wandering while watching his animals graze, replaying conversations with Catherine, and trying to understand what had caused her intense reaction to his mother's necklace. Several times he removed the chain to examine the pendant more carefully, but to his eyes, it remained the same simple silver medallion it had always been. Elena's mother, despite her failing health, seemed energized by the possibility of change in their circumstances. She had lived through many difficult periods and possessed the wisdom that comes from surviving decades of uncertainty. When Elena expressed concerns about accepting help from a stranger, the old woman reminded her that sometimes Providence worked through unexpected people and circumstances. The village itself buzzed with curiosity about the foreign woman who had returned to visit the herder's family. In a community where outsiders rarely appeared twice, Catherine's return had generated considerable speculation. Some neighbors worried that developers might be planning to purchase land in the area. Others suggested that Marcus might be involved in some sort of tourism project. Marcus tried to focus on practical matters, but found himself imagining what Catherine's investment might mean for his family's future. The roof repairs alone would cost more money than he typically earned in 3 months. Quality feed for his entire herd through the remaining dry season would require an investment that seemed impossible from his current perspective. On the appointed day, Catherine arrived earlier than expected, accompanied by a local man whom she introduced as Diego, a translator and guide she had hired for the week. Marcus noticed immediately that Catherine carried a much larger bag than during her previous visit, and her manner seemed more formal, almost businesslike. They gathered again on Marcus's small porch, but this time Catherine produced an impressive array of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be research materials. She began by thanking Marcus for allowing her to photograph his necklace, then launched into an explanation that would transform his understanding of his family's heritage forever. Catherine explained that after their last meeting, she had contacted several experts in antique jewelry and religious artifacts. The photographs of Marcus's necklace had been examined by specialists in 3 different countries, and the results of their analysis were remarkable. What Marcus had always assumed to be a simple silver medallion was actually a piece of considerable historical and monetary value. The pendant, according to the experts Catherine had consulted, appeared to be crafted from what was known as colonial silver, likely dating from the late 17th or early 18th century. The image of St. Francis had been hand-engraved by artisans whose techniques were characteristic of Spanish colonial religious metalwork. Most significantly, the silver itself showed signs of being sourced from mines that were historically significant in the region's colonial period. Marcus listened with growing amazement as Catherine explained that such pieces were extremely rare, with most examples held in museums or private collections of considerable value. The combination of the pendant's age, craftsmanship, and historical significance suggested that it might be worth significantly more than Marcus could have imagined. Diego, the translator, helped clarify some of the technical terms that Catherine used, but Marcus found himself struggling to process the information. The necklace that his mother had worn while milking goats and tending chickens, the simple chain that his grandmother had treasured as her most precious possession, was apparently a valuable historical artifact. Catherine then produced copies of auction records and museum catalogs showing similar pieces that had sold for amounts that seemed impossible to Marcus. Colonial-era religious medallions in good condition, particularly those with clear provenance and exceptional craftsmanship, could command prices ranging from several thousand to tens of thousands of dollars, depending on their specific historical significance and artistic merit. The revelation left Marcus speechless, but Catherine was not finished with her presentation. She explained that her research had extended beyond just the monetary value of the necklace. Working with historians and genealogical researchers, she had begun investigating the possible origins of the piece and its connection to Marcus's family history. What she had discovered was a story that connected Marcus's ancestry to some of the earliest European settlements in the region. Records suggested that his family line could be traced back to Spanish colonists who had been granted land in the area during the early colonial period. The necklace might have been commissioned by or gifted to one of Marcus's ancestors, possibly a woman of some standing in the colonial community. Elena, who had been listening quietly while managing another coughing fit, finally spoke up with a question that had been troubling Marcus as well. If the necklace was so valuable, what did Catherine expect him to do with this information? Surely she was not suggesting that he should sell his mother's most treasured possession, even if it might solve his immediate financial problems. Catherine's response revealed the true generosity of her character and the thoughtfulness with which she had approached Marcus's situation. She explained that she had no intention of encouraging him to sell the necklace if doing so would cause him emotional distress or disconnect him from his family's heritage. Instead, she had developed a proposal that would allow him to benefit from the piece's value while preserving his connection to it. Through her research, Catherine had connected with a museum in the regional capital that specialized in colonial-era artifacts and local history. The museum's director had expressed strong interest in displaying the necklace as part of a permanent exhibition about the area's colonial heritage. They were prepared to offer what they called a cultural stewardship agreement that would provide Marcus with immediate financial compensation while allowing the necklace to remain in the region where it had historical significance. Under such an arrangement, Marcus would retain legal ownership of the piece while loaning it to the museum for display and research purposes. The museum would provide insurance coverage, professional conservation services, and annual payments to Marcus for the privilege of displaying his family's heirloom. Most importantly, the agreement would include provisions allowing Marcus and his family to visit the necklace whenever they wished and to reclaim it permanently. If circumstances ever required such action, the financial terms that Catherine outlined were beyond anything Marcus had imagined possible. The initial payment for entering into the stewardship agreement would be sufficient to solve his immediate problems with feed, veterinary care, home repairs, and Elena's medical needs. The annual payments would provide ongoing financial security that would allow him to expand his herd and invest in improvements to his operation. But perhaps most meaningful to Marcus was Catherine's explanation of how the necklace's story would be presented in the museum. Rather than being displayed as an anonymous historical artifact, it would be presented as part of the living heritage of local families like his own. The exhibition would include information about traditional herding practices, the challenges facing contemporary rural communities, and the ways in which historical traditions continued to influence modern life in the region. As the afternoon wore on, and Catherine provided more details about the museum partnership, Marcus began to understand that she had created an opportunity for him to honor his mother's memory and his family's heritage, while also securing his family's future. The necklace would continue to represent the values and traditions it had always embodied, but now it would also serve as a bridge between past and present, connecting his family's story to the broader history of their region. Elena's excitement was evident despite her efforts to remain composed. For the first time in months, she seemed to be breathing more easily, as if the possibility of medical care and financial security had already begun to heal her persistent worry and stress. Marcus knew that his decision would affect not only his own family but potentially the way his community's history would be understood and preserved. The simple necklace that had represented his connection to his mother and grandmother was about to become a symbol of much larger themes of heritage, survival, and the unexpected ways that the past could provide for the future. The decision weighed heavily on Marcus throughout the night, following Catherine's remarkable presentation. He lay awake listening to Elena's labored breathing, turning over in his mind the implications of what he had learned about his family's necklace. The pendant that had rested against his chest for so many years suddenly felt different, as if its new significance had somehow altered its physical weight. Elena's mother provided unexpected wisdom the following morning. Despite her frail health, she had listened carefully to the previous day's discussions and had spent the night considering the situation from her perspective of 8 decades of life experience. Over breakfast, she reminded Marcus that objects derive their true value not from their monetary worth but from the love and memories they represent. The old woman shared stories that Marcus had never heard before about his grandmother, describing how the necklace had once helped their family during another period of severe hardship. During a particularly difficult drought in her youth, Marcus's great-grandmother had considered selling the piece to buy seed for the following year's planting. Instead, she had used it as collateral for a loan from the village priest, who had recognized its value and its importance to the family. This story resonated deeply with Marcus because it suggested that his ancestors had faced similar decisions about balancing practical needs with emotional attachments. The necklace had always been more than just jewelry. It had been a resource to be protected, but also utilized when family survival was at stake. Catherine returned the following day with additional information that further supported her proposal. She had spoken with the museum director by telephone, and he had agreed to travel to the village to meet Marcus personally and discuss the terms of the potential agreement. This gesture of respect impressed Marcus as it demonstrated that the museum viewed him as a partner rather than simply a source of artifacts. More significantly, Catherine had researched other families in the region who might have similar colonial-era pieces. She suggested that Marcus's participation in the museum's exhibition could encourage other local families to investigate their own family heirlooms, potentially creating a broader understanding of the area's historical significance. This community aspect of the project appealed to Marcus's sense of responsibility to his neighbors and his region's heritage. The museum director, Dr. Alejandro Ruiz, arrived 3 days later in a dust-covered vehicle that had clearly navigated the challenging roads to reach Marcus's remote village. A man in his 60s with silver hair and gentle mannerisms, Dr. Ruiz immediately impressed Marcus with his respectful approach and genuine interest in the family's history. Dr. Ruiz examined the necklace with the careful attention of a professional but also with evident appreciation for its significance to Marcus's family. He confirmed Catherine's assessment of the piece's historical importance and explained how it would fit into the museum's existing collections and educational programs. What particularly moved Marcus was Dr. Ruiz's explanation of how the necklace's story would be presented to museum visitors. Rather than focusing solely on its monetary value or historical significance, the exhibition would emphasize the continuity of family, traditions, and the ways in which historical objects continued to serve meaningful purposes in contemporary life. The museum director also addressed Marcus's concerns about losing control over his family's heirloom. He explained that the stewardship agreement could be structured to ensure that Marcus retained all ownership rights while benefiting from the piece's display value. The contract could include provisions allowing Marcus to reclaim the necklace for special occasions, family celebrations, or if his personal circumstances ever required its return. Elena participated actively in these discussions, asking practical questions about insurance, transportation, and security that demonstrated her growing comfort with the proposed arrangement. Her cough had worsened over the previous days, and Marcus could see in her eyes the hope that medical treatment might soon be accessible. The financial terms that Dr. Ruiz outlined were consistent with Catherine's earlier presentation, but included additional benefits that made the arrangement even more attractive. The museum would provide annual documentation of the necklace's condition, regular conservation services to ensure its preservation, and educational materials that Marcus could share with his family and community. Perhaps most importantly, the agreement would establish Marcus as a cultural consultant to the museum, providing him with ongoing income for sharing his knowledge of traditional herding practices, family history, and rural life in the region. This aspect of the arrangement appealed to Marcus because it recognized the value of his expertise and experience, making him a contributor rather than just a beneficiary. As the negotiations progressed over several days, Marcus found himself increasingly convinced that the arrangement would honor his mother's memory while providing practical benefits for his family's future. Elena's enthusiasm grew as she learned more about the medical care that would soon be available to her, and even their neighbors began to express pride that someone from their small village would be contributing to regional historical preservation. The formal signing of the agreement took place on a sunny morning in the presence of Catherine, Dr. Ruiz, Elena, and several neighbors who had become invested in the outcome. Marcus removed the necklace one final time before its temporary departure to the museum, holding it quietly for several minutes while remembering his mother and grandmother. As he handed the piece to Dr. Ruiz, Marcus experienced a mixture of sadness and excitement that surprised him. The necklace was leaving his daily possession for the first time in his adult life, but it was embarking on a journey that would connect his family's story to a much larger historical narrative. The immediate practical benefits of the agreement became apparent within days. Marcus was able to purchase high-quality feed for his entire herd, ensuring that his animals would remain healthy despite the ongoing drought. Elena scheduled an appointment with a respiratory specialist in the regional capital, and arrangements were made for her mother to receive regular medical monitoring for her heart condition. Catherine remained in the village for another week, documenting Marcus's daily routine with his goats and recording his knowledge of traditional herding practices. This material would become part of the museum's educational programs, ensuring that Marcus's expertise would be preserved and shared with future generations. The roof repairs began immediately, with local workers expressing amazement at Marcus's sudden ability to afford materials and labor that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Neighbors who had initially been suspicious of Catherine's involvement began to understand that something genuinely beneficial was happening for one of their community's most respected families. Marcus discovered that his new role as a cultural consultant required him to articulate knowledge and practices that he had previously taken for granted. Working with Catherine and Dr. Ruiz, he began documenting traditional methods of animal husbandry, weather prediction, and pasture management that his family had developed over generations. This process of documentation proved valuable in unexpected ways. By explaining his practices to outsiders, Marcus gained new insights into his own expertise and began to see his traditional knowledge as something worthy of preservation and respect. The confidence this gave him began to influence other aspects of his life, from his interactions with livestock buyers to his participation in village decision-making. As Catherine prepared to continue her travels through South America, she reflected on how her encounter with Marcus had changed her own understanding of meaningful philanthropy. Rather than simply providing charity, she had helped create a sustainable arrangement that honored cultural heritage while addressing practical needs. The transformation in Marcus's circumstances was remarkable, but the changes went beyond material improvements. The recognition of his family's historical significance and the validation of his traditional knowledge had given him a new sense of purpose and pride that would influence every aspect of his future endeavors. 6 months after the necklace had been installed in its place of honor at the regional museum, Marcus's life had transformed in ways that continued to surprise him daily. The financial security provided by the museum agreement had allowed him to expand his herd to 67 goats, the largest number he had owned since before the drought began. More importantly, Elena's health had improved dramatically after months of treatment with a pulmonary specialist who had identified and successfully treated her chronic respiratory infection. The museum's exhibition featuring his family's necklace had opened to considerable public interest. Dr. Ruiz reported that visitors were particularly engaged by the story of how a simple herding family had preserved such a significant piece of colonial history through generations of economic hardship. School groups regularly visited the display, and Marcus had been invited to speak to several classes about traditional herding practices and rural life. These speaking engagements had revealed an unexpected talent. Marcus discovered that he possessed a natural ability to explain complex agricultural concepts in ways that urban children could understand. His descriptions of reading weather patterns, understanding animal behavior, and managing natural resources resonated with audiences who had never considered the knowledge required for successful rural life. The success of these educational programs led to additional opportunities. The Regional Agricultural College invited Marcus to serve as a guest lecturer in their sustainable farming program. Recognizing that his traditional methods offered valuable insights for modern agricultural challenges, university researchers began visiting his operation to document techniques that had been passed down through generations but never formally studied. Elena had embraced her role as the wife of a suddenly prominent figure in regional cultural preservation. Her natural intelligence and practical wisdom made her an effective partner in Marcus's expanding activities. As her health improved, she began accompanying him to speaking engagements, often providing perspectives on rural family life that complemented his discussions of herding practices. The couple's increased visibility led to unexpected connections with other traditional farming families throughout the region. Marcus learned that several neighbors possessed family heirlooms that might have historical significance, and he began serving informally as a connector between these families and appropriate experts. This networking role evolved naturally from his experience with Catherine and the museum. Catherine herself had maintained regular contact with Marcus through letters and occasional phone calls. She had completed her South American travels and returned to Canada, but her experience with Marcus's family had inspired her to establish a small foundation focused on supporting rural communities in preserving their cultural heritage while adapting to modern economic realities. Through this foundation, Catherine had begun working with other families facing similar challenges to Marcus's original situation. She had learned that the combination of financial support, cultural validation, and educational opportunity that had transformed Marcus's circumstances could be replicated in other contexts with similarly dramatic results. The necklace itself had become a focal point for broader discussions about regional history and cultural preservation. Local newspapers had featured stories about the discovery, leading to increased tourism to the museum and growing recognition of the area's colonial heritage. This attention had resulted in government investment in infrastructure improvements that benefited the entire region. Marcus often visited the museum to see his family's necklace in its new setting. The display case was beautifully designed, with lighting that highlighted the intricate engraving work and informational panels that told the story of his family's stewardship of the piece. Reading about his grandmother and great-grandmother in the museum's professional historical context gave him a new appreciation for the strength and wisdom of the women who had shaped his family's values. The annual payment from the museum had arrived precisely on schedule, providing Marcus with resources to make additional improvements to his operation. He had invested in better shelter for his animals, improved fencing, and a water storage system that would help him manage future drought periods more effectively. These practical improvements demonstrated the sustainable nature of the arrangement Catherine had helped create. Elena's mother had lived to see the transformation in her family's circumstances, taking evident pride in Marcus's recognition as a cultural expert and Elena's recovery of her health. The old woman had passed away peacefully in her sleep during the spring, surrounded by family members who no longer worried about affording medical care or basic necessities. Marcus had requested temporary return of the necklace for his mother-in-law's funeral, and Dr. Ruiz had immediately agreed to this arrangement. Wearing the piece during the funeral service had felt deeply appropriate, connecting the ceremony to the long tradition of family continuity that the necklace represented. The success of Marcus's collaboration with the museum had inspired other cultural institutions to develop similar programs. Dr. Ruiz reported that museums throughout the country were beginning to explore stewardship agreements with local families, recognizing that such partnerships could enhance their collections while providing meaningful support to communities. Marcus's expertise as a traditional herder had gained recognition beyond the local region. Agricultural organizations invited him to conferences where he shared insights about sustainable grazing practices, drought management, and maintaining animal health using traditional methods. These presentations often emphasized how traditional knowledge could complement modern agricultural science, rather than being replaced by it. The transformation in Marcus's social status within his own community had been gradual but significant. Neighbors who had previously seen him as simply another struggling herder now recognized him as someone whose knowledge and experience had broader value. Young people from the village began seeking his advice about whether traditional livelihoods could provide viable career paths. Elena had used some of their improved financial resources to establish a small cooperative with other village women, producing traditional crafts and food products for the growing number of tourists who visited the area. This enterprise provided additional income for several families while preserving traditional skills that might otherwise have been lost. The couple had also been able to make long-postponed improvements to their home, but they had chosen to maintain its traditional character while adding modern conveniences. The repaired roof, updated plumbing, and improved kitchen made their daily life more comfortable without changing the essential nature of their rural lifestyle. Marcus often reflected on the chain of events that had begun with Catherine's casual question about his necklace. The transformation in his family's circumstances had been remarkable, but equally important was the recognition that his traditional way of life had value and relevance in the modern world. This validation had given him confidence to advocate for rural communities and traditional practices in ways he never could have imagined. The story of the necklace had also strengthened Marcus's connection to his family history. Learning about his colonial-era ancestors had given him a deeper appreciation for the continuity of his family's presence in the region. This historical perspective made him more committed to preserving traditional practices while adapting to contemporary challenges. 2 years had passed since the necklace had first captured Catherine's attention, and the ripple effects of that moment continued to expand in directions that none of the original participants could have anticipated. Marcus had evolved from a struggling herder into an influential advocate for rural communities, while maintaining his commitment to the traditional practices that had defined his family for generations. The museum exhibition featuring his necklace had become one of the institution's most popular permanent displays. Visitor numbers had increased significantly, with many tourists specifically requesting guided tours that included Marcus's family story. Dr. Ruiz had expanded the exhibition to include artifacts and stories from other local families, creating a comprehensive presentation of the region's rural heritage that attracted scholarly attention from universities across the continent. Marcus's role as a cultural consultant had expanded beyond his original arrangement with the museum. The regional government had commissioned him to help develop tourism initiatives that would showcase traditional rural life while providing economic benefits to farming communities. This work required him to balance his advocacy for traditional practices with the practical needs of families seeking economic opportunities. The agricultural college where Marcus served as a guest lecturer had offered him a permanent position as an instructor in traditional farming methods. This opportunity represented a significant departure from his life as a herder, but Marcus had negotiated an arrangement that allowed him to maintain his own livestock operation while teaching 3 days per week. The position provided additional income and professional recognition while preserving his connection to the land. Elena had become an accomplished public speaker in her own right, often accompanying Marcus to conferences and cultural events where she discussed the role of women in maintaining rural traditions. Her recovery from the respiratory illness that had once threatened her health had become part of their family's testimony to the transformative power of access to medical care and economic security. The success of Catherine's foundation had attracted the attention of international development organizations interested in replicating her model of supporting rural communities through cultural preservation initiatives. Catherine had returned to visit Marcus's family twice, documenting the long-term effects of their partnership and using their story to attract additional funding for similar projects. During her most recent visit, Catherine had brought news that would once again expand Marcus's understanding of his family's historical significance. Additional research conducted by genealogical specialists had revealed that his colonial-era ancestors had played important roles in establishing some of the region's earliest agricultural settlements. This discovery had implications for land rights and historical recognition that could benefit the entire community. The necklace itself had become the subject of scholarly research by historians studying colonial-era religious artifacts and their role in maintaining cultural identity among rural populations. Academic papers had been published analyzing the piece's craftsmanship and historical context, further establishing its significance beyond its monetary value. Marcus had used his growing influence to advocate for government policies supporting small-scale agriculture and rural infrastructure development. His testimony before regional legislative committees carried weight because of his recognized expertise and his ability to articulate the challenges facing traditional farming communities in terms that urban policymakers could understand. The cooperative that Elena had established with other village women had grown into a successful enterprise employing 15 families and selling products to shops in the regional capital. The cooperative's success had attracted grants from development organizations, allowing them to expand their production capacity and develop new product lines based on traditional recipes and crafts. Marcus's herd had stabilized at an optimal size that allowed him to maintain quality while managing his expanded responsibilities. The improved pasture management techniques he had developed through combining traditional knowledge with modern agricultural science had attracted attention from researchers studying sustainable grazing practices in semi-arid environments. The annual payment from the museum continued to provide financial security, but Marcus had discovered that the arrangement's greatest value lay in the opportunities it had created, rather than the direct financial benefits. The recognition of his expertise had opened doors to income sources and professional relationships that had transformed his family's long-term prospects. Young people from the village and surrounding communities had begun seeking Marcus's mentorship, interested in learning whether traditional livelihoods could be adapted to provide viable careers in the modern economy. Marcus had developed informal apprenticeship programs that combined traditional herding techniques with modern business practices and educational opportunities. The success of these mentorship programs had led to proposals for establishing a formal training center focused on sustainable rural livelihoods. Government agencies and international development organizations had expressed interest in supporting such an initiative, recognizing the potential for replicating Marcus's model of combining traditional knowledge with contemporary economic opportunities. Elena's health had remained stable, and the couple had been able to establish a small emergency fund that provided security against future medical expenses or agricultural setbacks. This financial cushion had given them confidence to take calculated risks in expanding their activities and pursuing new opportunities. The transformation in their social status within the broader region had been remarkable. Marcus was regularly invited to participate in conferences, policy discussions, and cultural events where his perspective was valued by academics, government officials, and development professionals. This recognition had given him a platform to advocate for rural communities throughout the region. The story of the necklace had inspired other families to investigate their own heritage and family heirlooms. Several significant historical discoveries had resulted from this increased interest in family history, leading to a broader understanding of the region's colonial past and its influence on contemporary rural culture. Marcus often reflected on the unpredictable nature of the changes that had transformed his life. The casual encounter with a curious tourist had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of his family's circumstances and his role in his community. These changes had occurred not through luck or charity, but through the recognition and validation of knowledge and traditions that he had always possessed. The relationship with Catherine had evolved into a lasting friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to supporting rural communities. Her foundation had established a permanent fund to support similar initiatives throughout South America, using Marcus's story as a model for how cultural preservation and economic development could be successfully integrated. The museum's stewardship agreement had proven to be perfectly structured to meet the needs of all parties involved. Marcus retained his emotional connection to the necklace while benefiting from its historical significance. The museum had acquired a centerpiece for its regional heritage exhibition, and the community had gained recognition for its cultural contributions to the broader historical narrative. Dr. Ruiz had become a close friend and collaborator, often consulting with Marcus on museum policies and exhibition development. Their partnership had demonstrated how academic institutions could work effectively with community members to preserve and present cultural heritage in ways that served both scholarly and community interests. The success of these various initiatives had attracted media attention that extended beyond the local region. National television programs and magazines had featured stories about Marcus's transformation from struggling herder to cultural advocate, inspiring similar initiatives in other rural areas facing economic challenges. 5 years after Catherine Morrison had first noticed the simple silver necklace hanging around Marcus's neck, the herder stood before an audience of international development specialists at a conference in the capital city, sharing his story with delegates from 12 countries. The transformation seemed almost impossible to believe, yet every detail was documented and verified by the numerous organizations that had studied his case as a model for sustainable rural development. The conference hall was filled with academics, government officials, and development professionals who had come to learn about innovative approaches to supporting traditional communities. Marcus wore a suit that Elena had helped him select, but around his neck hung the familiar weight of his mother's necklace, which the museum had provided for this special occasion. The sight of the pendant against his formal attire symbolized the successful integration of tradition and modernity that his story represented. As Marcus concluded his presentation, describing how a simple conversation about family heritage had evolved into a comprehensive model for rural community development, the audience responded with sustained applause. Questions followed from delegates interested in replicating similar programs in their own countries. Recognizing that Marcus's experience offered insights applicable to traditional communities worldwide. Catherine Morrison sat in the front row, beaming with pride at how far her initial intuitive gesture had evolved. Her foundation had grown into an internationally recognized organization, supporting similar projects across 3 continents. The success of Marcus's partnership had provided a template that had been adapted to support traditional craftspeople in Peru, sustainable farmers in Ecuador, and fishing communities in coastal Chile. Dr. Ruiz had traveled from the regional museum to introduce Marcus's presentation, describing how the partnership had transformed not only Marcus's family but the entire institution's approach to community engagement. The museum had become a model for other cultural institutions seeking to develop mutually beneficial relationships with the communities whose heritage they preserved and presented. Elena watched from the audience as her husband fielded questions from delegates with the confidence and expertise that had developed over years of public speaking and community advocacy. Her own journey from a struggling farmer's wife to a successful cooperative leader and respected voice for rural women had paralleled Marcus's transformation, demonstrating how individual opportunities could create expanding circles of positive change. The necklace itself had become far more than a family heirloom or museum artifact. Scholarly research had established its historical significance in understanding colonial-era religious practices and craft traditions. Educational programs based on its story had reached thousands of students, using Marcus's family narrative to teach lessons about heritage preservation, economic development, and cultural continuity. The success of Marcus's model had attracted attention from the United Nations Development Program, which had commissioned a comprehensive study of his case as part of their research into sustainable approaches to rural poverty reduction. The resulting report had been distributed to development agencies worldwide, establishing Marcus's story as an international example of effective community-based development. Back in his home village, the changes initiated by the necklace discovery had created lasting benefits for the entire community. The improved roads and infrastructure that had resulted from increased tourism continued to serve local residents. The training programs that Marcus had developed had enabled dozens of young people to develop skills that allowed them to maintain rural livelihoods while participating in the modern economy. The cooperative that Elena had established had evolved into a regional network of rural women's enterprises, providing income opportunities for families throughout the area, while preserving traditional craft and food production techniques. The success of these enterprises had demonstrated that rural communities could maintain their cultural identity while achieving economic sustainability. Marcus's herd had become a demonstration site for sustainable grazing practices, attracting visitors from agricultural colleges and research institutions. The techniques he had developed by combining traditional knowledge with modern, scientific understanding had been documented and shared with herding communities facing similar environmental challenges in other regions. The annual payments from the museum had continued reliably, providing Marcus's family with long-term financial security while supporting the ongoing preservation and presentation of their heritage. The arrangement had proven so successful that similar agreements had been established between museums and families throughout the country, creating a new model for cultural preservation that benefited both institutions and communities. The relationship between Marcus and Catherine had evolved into a lasting friendship that transcended their original roles as beneficiary and donor. Catherine's annual visits to the village had become community celebrations, with neighbors gathering to hear about the international expansion of programs inspired by Marcus's story. Their correspondence throughout the year provided both with ongoing insights into the long-term effects of their partnership. Marcus's role as a cultural consultant had expanded to include work with international organizations developing policies for rural community support. His practical experience and ability to articulate the perspectives of traditional communities had made him a valued advisor on projects throughout Latin America. This work had taken him to other countries, where he had learned about different approaches to similar challenges. The success of the various initiatives had created opportunities for Marcus's extended family and neighbors that would have been unimaginable during the difficult years before Catherine's arrival. Young people who might once have been forced to migrate to cities in search of work now had viable options for remaining in rural communities while building successful careers. Elena, had been invited to serve on the board of a national organization promoting rural women's economic development, bringing her practical experience and community perspective to policy discussions at the highest levels. Her transformation from a woman worried about affording medical care to a recognized leader in rural development demonstrated the far-reaching effects of addressing basic human needs. The museum exhibition featuring the necklace had been expanded twice to accommodate growing visitor interest and additional historical discoveries. The display now included artifacts and stories from numerous local families, creating a comprehensive presentation of regional heritage that attracted visitors from around the world and generated significant revenue for the local economy. As Marcus returned home from the international conference, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with Catherine's simple question about his necklace. The changes in his life had been dramatic, but they had occurred without requiring him to abandon the values and traditions that defined his identity. Instead, those traditions had been recognized, validated, and transformed into resources for building a better future. The necklace continued to rest against his chest as he walked among his goats in the familiar hills overlooking his village. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities and opportunities that arose from his expanding role as an advocate and educator, but the fundamental rhythms of rural life that had sustained his family for generations remained unchanged. The simple silver pendant that his grandmother had treasured had indeed been his mother's, but it had become something more. A symbol of how heritage, when properly valued and supported, could provide a foundation for transformation that honored the past while building hope for the future. The story that had begun with a struggling herder pointing to his necklace and saying, "It was my mother's," had evolved into an international model for how traditional communities could thrive in the modern world while preserving the cultural heritage that gave their lives meaning and continuity.